my name's Paul Marsh, and today I want to talk about serializing data in Unity. And I wanted to approach this from the topic of the whys and hows of it, because I think it's quite confusing given there's different sorts of mechanisms that are out there. So if I can figure out how to do next slide in this. So really, what are we talking about when we say serialization? I mean, the fundamentals of it is that we've got some kind of object, and we can see that object in things like the inspector, or we can see that object in our game or whatever code we're writing. And we need some way of converting that into something where we can store it away and then retrieve it. And typically that's somewhere on disk, but it might be another site, website, or API. And there are different ways of doing that. And they have different sorts of names and very similar names, and that's why it can get quite confusing. So if we look at this slide here, we can see that we've got .NET serialization, and that is similar to Unity serialization, but there are some differences, and they're both called serialization, and that adds to the confusion. And in fact, they use and share some of the same components, so it makes that overlap makes it even more confusing. But there we go, that's where we are. But also, when we're talking about serialization, as I mentioned, when we move to sites and APIs, there are other ways of moving that data around, and you'll typically find that that's done using another sets of formats called XML and JSON typically. And serialization can produce that as well, but we'll see that that's not necessarily the best way of going about it. And even when it comes to XML and JSON, there are other ways of doing it and other choices and things that need to be considered when you look at those. So all in all, it's quite a broad topic. So we'll try and cover some of those choices in this presentation. Okay, let's get on to the next slide. So what do we need to do? We've got some object that we need to store. And then we have a choice if we could do that manually, or we could do that automatically. So let's have a look what I'm talking about when I say what a POCO object is, a plain old CLR or C# object. So in Unity, I've got a very simple scene. We can't get much simpler than this. We've just got a game object, and on the game object, I've got a script. So let's have a look at that script. And it's an empty mono behavior. And what I've also created is something called a POCO person. So it's a plain old C# person. And all we're going to do is populate this. So it really means that it's just really about the data. There's nothing, it's not doing anything particularly exciting. It's just a very simple object. So we're going to create a string on there, and we're going to give it, let's call it surname. And then we're going to create a property to access that string, and its surname. That's fine. And in fact, I've done this all the wrong way around. So let's convert that to a full property and just rename that one. Okay. So that's our very simple object. So how do we create that? Well, that's relatively easy. So we can just do a new POCO person. And we can say that their surname is Smith. Okay, so how do we serialize it with .NET? Well, what we do is we have a look at a walkthrough of serializing objects in .NET. And we can see here that I'll just copy this, talk you through it. So this is a save stream. Now I'm not going to actually put it out to disk. I'm just going to use a memory stream. So it's a new memory stream. memory stream. We're going to use a using statement because we are good .NET citizens. We don't use close statements. Okay, and we are going to serialize our person into this stream. And that's it. That is what happens. So all we're doing here is we've got our .NET object. We create some kind of stream, and typically that is a file stream, but it could be a stream to some other mechanism like a network protocol, or in SQL Server it might be some kind of file stream directly to SQL Server. But in this case, we are just putting it into memory. We're using a particular kind of formatter. So in serialization, you can format it. You can have different formatters. You could do SOAP request or strings, or in this case, binary, because binary tends to be the smallest output. So it's the most efficient way in terms of size of getting stuff out there. I mean, you could probably argue that depending on the kind of data you're saving, but let's just go with binary formatter for now. So we're saving that, and that's all good. And now we need some way of getting it back. So back to the example. We haven't got a file, so we don't need any of that nonsense. We've already got our stream, so we don't care about that. But what we do need to do is when you write to a stream, it moves the stream's pointer along. So we do need just to reposition the position of the stream back to 0. So it brings the kind of read pointer back so we can reuse it. And what we've got is we're going to have our rehydrated person. And we're going to deserialize that from our save stream. Don't need any of that. We don't need that. So we can just do a little print. What can we say here? We could say our person, and we can say the surname. We could say the .NET's hash code. So that's the code, internal representation of that object. And then we can do our rehydrated person. So we can do the same thing here. Surname and the hash code. Okay, so let's see what happens when we run. Warnings. Did that run? Didn't run. Ooh. Okay, so we're getting an error. It's our first error. So it's saying that basically the type, the POCO person, can't be serialized. So we do need to add one additional thing to the plain old object. So this is where it starts to move slightly away from just being plain. So we need to say that this thing is serializable. Let's run that again. So now we've got some results. So our person, Smith, who instance is -5084, has been rehydrated to a person, Smith, and to a different ID. So we can see here that we are actually getting different results. So that's good. Okay, but that's very simple. So let's come back to our code and let's start adding a few more things to this to try and make it a little bit more realistic. So what should we have? We could have an age. So let's create another property, go int age. And this one, should we leave that one? I'll leave that one, print age, that's fine. And we'll do the same trick. Convert to a full property and just rename that. Rename age. And we'll give ourselves a forename as well. So we can have a string forename, but this time we'll use auto properties. Okay, so we go back to our thing here and we can say age equals 30, forename equals Faye. Now, we don't want to keep writing this out, so I'll just get rid of this and we can extend our POCO object to be a bit more friendly in this case. So we'll return surname, forename, and our age is age. Okay. So all we've done here is add a few more properties, basically. So do they all serialize? So we've got name, Smith, Faye, age 30, name, Smith, Faye, age 30. So that's great. Now, let's just pop back to the slides, making sure we're doing everything we can here. So let's make .NET serializable, different formatters, yeah, private fields. Okay, let's have a little think about that. So what we've got is our object, and you'll notice that even though these fields are private, that they are being serialized. And it's these fields that have been serialized, not the public ones. And we can show that by saying, well, we don't want the kind of privacy invasion of knowing people's ages. So we can say, use an attribute and say, this one isn't serializable. So then when we come and do our run now, what we should see is the age won't appear. So the age is 30, but when we rehydrate it, the age is 0. So because we haven't serialized that data. So that's showing two different things, really. It's showing that you can have control over what the serialization engine does, and also that we are affecting the private field. We're not using the properties. So that's kind of interesting. Where does that really leave us? So that's our kind of .NET stuff, and it's, you know, it's fairly simple, but at the moment it's not particularly flexible. And also, how does that relate to what's happening in Unity? So let's have a look at our Unity kind of version of this. So if we go back to our .NET Serialization class, and we can just come in here and we can use a public POCO person, and we can call this person. Nothing wrong with that. And what we're going to do here is we'll show you. So let's go to our inspector. So person shows up, but there's nothing we can do with it. Why is that? So if we look at the person object again, we've got a private field. Okay, so Unity can't see that. We've got public properties and Unity's serialization mechanism, because it's very similar to .NET Serializable. It doesn't understand, it can't see those, it's not exposed to those. And as we know, we can expose those by using another attribute, a Unity specific attribute called Serialize field. And we can put that on the surname. So our surname appears, so we could put in blogs in that. And then that blogs is going to live beyond just me running it once. So what's happening here is Unity is using a very similar serialization mechanism, and it's saving this this version of the person to disk somewhere, or maybe memory somewhere. I don't really care where it is. We just know that it's safely squirreled away somewhere. So we've got serialize field, that's good, and we've got our private, that's fine, but we've got our forename that we'd like to show. So we can show our age easy enough by doing that, changing it to that. And we can do the forename by using a special field attribute. So when we do that, and we come back here, we should have all of them available to us. But you get the age, that's fine, because that's exactly the same kind of mechanism as the surname. But the forename, horrible. We can see it's using this backing field notation, and that is pretty ugly. You don't really want to be doing that. There's supposed to be a label mechanism to help you around that, but I've never seen that work. So that's pretty ugly stuff. Okay. Right. Now, that's all well and good, and we can see that we've got some constraints, and we could do other kind of things. So with Unity, we can see how we got our hierarchy, and that we can store things in that hierarchy, and we can expose those using serializable field. And we could use preference data and just store strings in that instead of using serialization. And that's all fine. These are all options that are available to us. But can we do something a little bit more interesting? Okay, so let's have a look at that. So we've got our plain old person, and what we want to do is say, well, yeah, okay, I kind of want the age to be exposed, but I'm going to get that data via some other mechanism. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to go back to saying that's not serialized. Right, so let's just come back here and check what happens to our inspector. Okay, so that's gone in there, and then if we run this, we should get our age 0 back. Yeah, so that's all fine. And what we can do is here is we can say that this implements serializable. And then when we do that, we can implement the interface, and we get this new mechanism called getObject. And this is a relatively simple way. It's quite manual, but it is more flexible. So we can come in here and we can say something along the lines of info add value, and we're going to add our age. We can call it anything that we want, just as long as it's unique, and we're going to store the age in there. Okay. That's going to store the thing that we're saying we don't want stored. We are actually going to store it. Right? I mean, this is a bit artificial, but hey ho. Now, the way you get this information back is you need a constructor. So we need to add our POCO person. First of all, we need a default constructor. Just not going to do anything. And then we're going to do something. So we get passed in the same kind of stuff we do on the way out with serialization. And we just have to make this protected. Just because it's serializable, and that's kind of what we should do as good citizens if we're not using a sealed class. Right. Okay, and that means that we can use the same syntax here. So we can say info get value age version 2. In fact, just to get 32. Oh, does it not get 32? Let's have a look. Info get. Oh, I thought we could do. Okay, I thought we could do get value. Get int. Get int 32. Yeah. So we can set the age. Set our age based on that. So just to recap what's happening here, we're telling the Serialize engine that we don't want to save the age. And then what we're doing is we are actually using our custom formatting mechanism and saying, well, I'm going to create a new property called age. And I'm going to put it into there. And in a similar way, we could do that with full name. So where we're using the auto properties here, we could just store the full name instead. So we could do a very similar thing in here and just do info.addValue full name and then full name, and then say that the full name equals info get string full name. So if we didn't want to have the kind of backing field, we want to give it a sort of proper name, full name. Okay, so let's see how we get on with that. So name for age. So we're getting our age back, and it's all still rehydrating correctly. And we can see it's doing the correct stuff. So on the way back in, we could just say, multiply that by 100. And there we go. So phase now 3000. Right. Now it's a bit artificial, that example, I admit, but you can see that you can get around some of these issues about properties not being serialized by implementing your own custom Serialize engine or custom rules when you do Serialize. So that's quite good. So we've got to a point now that we've got stuff that's quite flexible. We can do some stuff with it that you can't necessarily, or isn't necessarily obvious to do out of the box. But really, that's kind of the end of it when it comes to using serialization. And we can see that a lot of this stuff is sort of shared between how Unity does its serialization and how just .NET does it. You know, there's a kind of overlap going on here. Very similar ways of doing things. Okay, so, and in fact you can use some of the customizations with the serializable object from here as well. If you'll still have the problem of exposing it in the inspector. So ultimately, it's not the greatest of solutions, or the most flexible of solutions. But there we are. That's how it all sort of comes together. Now, what we've been talking about really is a very plain .NET serialization and also how it works with Unity and with that overlap. But in reality, we want to be using data from different places. And that really means talking to server APIs. And to do that, there is a set of standards that are out there. So we can think about things like XML and particular forms of XML, like SOAP standards. And that is a particular sort of protocol of how you talk to a server using XML messages. But more recently, and I say recently, probably 5 to 10 years, the JSON standard has come out, which is a kind of JavaScript object notation. And that is a way of also representing objects and data moving between places, typically, again, APIs. And when we talk about these standards, what we're thinking about is how easy it is to maintain, how easy it is to read, how easy it is to change, how easy it is for all different sorts of clients, regardless of whether you're on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, phones, whatever it is that you're using. How can you consume this data? How easy is it for you to do that? And also, when we think about servers and we think about mobile devices and things like that, network traffic, we're also concerned about the size of these messages. So whatever format we choose, we want to try and keep it as small as possible and as easy to maintain as possible. Right. Okay, so let's have a look at what I mean by JSON and XML. Okay, so what do the other serialization mechanisms look like? So let's switch over to our .NET example. And what I've done is I've jumped ahead a little bit here. So I've commented out the code that we were using before, our binary formatter. And now I'm using something slightly different. So here we've got our DataContract serializer. This is the important thing. And in this particular example, we're using an XML dictionary writer. So it works in a very similar way. We have a serializer, have our object, we serialize it, and we write it out to the stream. In this case, I'm writing it out to the application path person. And then we're going to read it back in and just print it. That's going to be our XML. And then, in a similar way, we're going to use DataContract JSON serializer. So this is our first introduction to JSON. And we're going to write that out to person.json rather than person.xml. And in a similar way, we're just going to take a file stream, have a writer, use this contract serializer, write the object exactly the same way. It's exactly the same pattern. We don't need that. That was just me mucking around. Get rid of that. And then we can read that file back in. So let's have a look what that gives us. So back over here, we can run. Oh, errors. Where have I got an error? MS does not exist. Oh, yes. I don't want to be writing that. I want to be writing to the stream. I want to write to the stream. Oh, I don't want that at all. Okay. Right, okay. Try that again. Now, when I read this stuff back, what you'll see is I've got XML. This is what the XML looks like. So POCO person. We've got a namespace for XMLs, but then not a lot else. And equally, if you look at the JSON, we've just got empty braces. So what's going on here? So go back to our code. So POCO person, what does this look like now? So this now, rather than serializable, has a new thing on it called a DataContract. Now that allows our JSON and XML DataContract serializers to work. And although we've got serialized field and non-serialized field in there, nothing's actually happening. Now the DataContract serializer uses a different attribute. So we can come along here and we can say data member, and then we can give it a name. So we can say name equals, let's just go surname. Actually, use a capital N so we can note that we use lowercase n here. But for here, we're going to use, just for the sake of an example, capital N. And then we're going to come down here and say age, and then forename. Now, a couple of interesting things coming along here, we'll see whether it works or not, is data member is working on the field here, not the property. And the data member is working on the properties here. So is this actually going to work? So we run that. So now in our XML, we get our age and a forename and our weird surname thing. So it looks like it does work. And then if we have a look at our JSON output, we can see that we've got age, forename, and surname here. And you notice also that the surname is using that other name. So this is good news. So this is our first example of using a different serialization mechanism. And that's, that is what it is. We are serializing an object to and from a different format than it starts its life in. We actually haven't done the from, but the from is just a deserializer. It's very simple. So we go back to our slides. So that's kind of what JSON XML are. And if we look at the size of the message, so we come back here, you can see that XML contains quite a lot of additional information. It has additional information in terms of its namespacing, which is what we can do to prefix elements. It also has quite a lot of additional sort of mechanisms around it. So you have a lot more less than, greater than brackets, forward slashes, backslashes. You have all these sorts of things in there that make XML work. Whereas you compare that with JSON, and you can see the JSON is a lot slimmer. There's a lot less going on there. So in terms of making the message smaller, that's why people tend to favor JSON these days over XML. And the other thing you can probably notice is that, which one's more readable? Well, it's a difficult one. You could probably argue that maybe in certain cases XML is easier to read. And certainly when you start getting into arrays and things like that, it starts to get a little bit complex with JSON. But overall, JSON isn't that difficult to read. We can clearly see the different properties in here and the values. It's not that difficult. And we can also have different tools to make either of these pieces of data prettier. And I'll show you perhaps I'll be able to show you what I mean by that. So if we bring in the actual file here, we can see that here's our JSON file. And with a little bit of formatting, quickly do in Visual Studio, we can see already this makes it a lot easier to read. And it's the same data. It's just had a few carriage returns put into it. That makes that a lot easier to read. And similarly with XML, I'm sure I've got, is this going to open? Oh, there we go. Yeah, okay, Edge. So Edge has opened this, and you can see that it's also formatted this in quite a reasonable way. We can clearly see with the age and forename surname, much easier to read like this, and we can collapse it and deal with things like that. So both those formats are pretty easy to read. So that's good news. Okay, so given that the size of JSON is a lot smaller, and let's face it, it is used by lots more APIs than the XML equivalent. JSON is typically what you'll see these days. Now, one of the things I didn't really mention here, although I kind of touched on it, is the shaping of the data. And this is particularly important with JSON, not so much with XML, but certainly with JSON. And what do I mean by the shaping of the data? So as we saw here with surname, we don't have to have the same serialized names as we do for our internal names. Now, the JSON standard is different to C#. So with JSON, what we're likely to see is something that looks like this. So it'll be all kind of all lowercase with JavaScript standards. And I'm just trying to think if we had surname, trying to think of a way to get my next word in, surname value, say, for example. It might be something like that. So you might have an API that's kicking out this as its results. But because we're C# people, we don't want that. We want it to be in to come into our properties. So I can move that out there, for example, and just put oops, I've lost my clipboard. So here we can just say, right, when you save, I want you to save it out as a JavaScript or Java-based naming convention, but when it comes back into C#, it needs to be in this value. And the same with age, we want it to come back as a capital A, and same with forename. And this is termed shaping the data. And this is particularly useful for, as I say, for talking to JSON. And it's something that you don't really get very easily from a serializer. Although, as we saw, you can use a custom serializer to do that, but you don't get it by default. So that's another important thing when you're considering how to use your JSON. Okay, so that's what shaping means. Yeah, your own data. Yes, you could. When you have your own data, what we talked about is serializing using various built-in contract serializers, using the serializable and using JSON and XML. But there's nothing stopping you just writing a string out, right? So we could, for example, come into here and I could get this stream writer, and we could concatenate a string of all the properties together and do something like that. But there's just so many pitfalls for doing that. You got to do your, how do you do comma separated variables if you've got commas in your data, that sort of thing. So it gets very complicated. So it's just not worth doing. These formats are there and they're pretty robust. You're not going to trick them very easily. Whereas if you try and roll your own saving mechanism, it's just, you're going to get into trouble unless it's incredibly simple. Right, so yeah, don't do that. Use one of these techniques. Okay. So JSON, well, JSON has a lot of different choices. So what we'll do next is we'll cover what some of them are. Okay, so JSON, what are our options? Well, we could do a string. So we could do something like, get it here, and surname, colon, Smith. We could do something like that and save it to disk, but you're just going to get into a nightmare of problems. You're going to get it wrong. You're going to get the quotes in the wrong place. How do you deal with double quotes? It's just a nightmare. You just don't even want to go there, right? So you want to use something that's going to do the parsing and ensure that you get a good result. So there's a kind of newish thing in Unity called the JsonUtility. It's quite easy to use. So it's toJSON, and we're going to get the person, and we're going to assign that to our string. And then we're going to run this. So let's run that. Empty. Okay. Okay. Let's not panic. Right, so we go back to our person. Now this is Unity, so it's going to be using the same rules as it did before. So we can do serialize field, and for our auto property, serialize field. Okay, and we have to add our magic field. Brilliant. So back to here again. Run this, and underscore surname. Okay. Well, we know why, but underscore age. Look at the backing field. Horrible. Now, if you're going to be talking to a server API, and you phone up your server API vendor and you say, this is what I'm going to be sending you. Right, when they stop laughing at you and the tears stop rolling down their face, then you're going to get a little note saying, I never want to work with you again. You're the most useless developer in the world. So we kind of want to avoid that happening. So this doesn't seem very good. I mean, to be fair to it, if you're putting stuff into your own file system and you're never talking to anyone else, another third party, then this is okay. All right, it's all right. It's not very readable. I mean, it's ugly as sin, really. Just awful. Okay. So do we have an alternative? Well, we do have another alternative, and that is in the form of JSON.NET. But here comes the rub with JSON.NET. You've got to add it, right? So I look in my plugins down here, and I don't seem to have it. So I can go to the asset store, and here's JSON.NET. You can download it, you can import it, it's free. Press the import. And if I take a quick look down here, I can see that actually, because I'm using Game Dev HQ, they're actually including it in here. So normally I would just import all of this, but actually I'm already running it. So I can just use the existing one. But it does mean that I do have this DLL hanging around, and it means that I've got to export it with my app. If I was going to Android or iOS or something like that, that means just another thing to add to the size of the delivery, which isn't good. But let's see if it's worth that extra size. So let's come back in here. So I wasn't very happy with that, to say the least. So let's do something similar. Do JSON convert. Again, pretty easy. Serialize object. Okay, so the terminology is a little bit more technical, but okay, it's not that hard. We know what serialization is about. So we're just going to serialize that object. Let's go back to our POCO thing and get rid of all this stuff. Serialize field, serialize field, serialize field. All right, so it's a completely empty object, a nice clean plain old object as we wanted originally, the plain old CLR object. So let's run this. We'll get that ugly thing off. Run. Look at that. Oh, surname Smith. It just works, and it's using the right names from the properties, right? Not the fields, from the properties. This is what I want. Right, this is what I want. Okay. So how do I shape it? Because that's not, if I'm talking to an API, as we said before, I want to be able to shape the data. Well, we can just do JSON property. And we can give it lots of options, but basically the default one is a name. So we can use the lowercase for surname and use a value thing. So just to explicitly show you that we are making a change and we are adhering to the standards of JSON, naming conventions of JSON. And we'll give this one for name value. So, okay, we've decorated a little bit, not quite the plain old object we want, but hey ho, this isn't difficult. And let's run that. Beautiful. That's what we want to see. And now we can phone up our API guy on the server, and he's going to go, oh, and she'll say to us, that's brilliant. You've done such a great job. You're the most wonderful developer I've ever worked with. That's what we want to hear. Great. Now, okay, let's just remove this for a moment. Go back to our plain old object. In fact, I'm going to undo all this all the way back to our JsonUtility serialize field. Right. Next up, let's do something a little bit more semi-realistic. So I've got a class here called household. It's got a dictionary based on, going to be based on the person's name and the person. All right. Pretty simple stuff. And this is the kind of stuff that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. You would see this coming out of APIs. There's certainly lists of stuff, but yeah, dictionary stuff, why not? Okay, let's go back to our JSON code and a little bit of code I prepared earlier. So we'll create a little database. So here's our household, and it's got people in it, which is a dictionary. We're adding our Faye in there, and we're adding a new one called Joe. So they're in a rather disgusting one line because, you know, I'm being disgusting. That's there. But it's just going to moan at me. I wonder if it will just do. I thought it might even say, oi, I'll tidy it up. No, it's not. Okay, whatever. Right, so we're serializing an object, and the object is person. Let's just check that that is all. Actually, go back to our JsonUtility. And we should hopefully get our disgusting JsonUtility version of the person come out. There we are. Disgusting. Walk. Right. Okay, that's fair enough. But what we want to do is the household. So let's put household in there. Just really easy, really simple ask. Nothing. Okay. But perhaps I need to serialize, add the serialize information to household. That would seem reasonable. So let's put serialize field, and because it's a property, we only need the backing object. Over to here. Still nothing. Man, I'm not liking JsonUtility. It really is not my friend. Oh no, it is not. So let's get rid of the unitiness of this. So back to our plain old. Nothing exciting here. Nothing to see. Move along. And we'll move over to JSON.NET. Do the person first. Let's do the same. Just make sure person's been. Oh, look at it. Look at the loveliness of it. Perfect. Okay, and let's move to household. And run that. Well, look at that. It works. We've got our people. It's got Faye in there. It's got Joe in there. It just works. It just works, people. It just works. So, yeah. So where does that leave us? Okay, well, we know we don't want to do strings. JsonUtility, well, it's great if you're just doing, local clienty stuff and your stuff isn't complex and, very simple stuff. I mean, nothing wrong with that. But it is ugly as sin. It's not going to help you if you're talking to APIs. I mean, it's got no real shaping. It's just a disaster, really. For me, it's way off where it needs to be. So JSON.NET, well, we've seen that's really simple to use, really flexible. Yeah, but we have to carry DLL with us. It's a shame, but there it is. So what's this little additional bit down here? System.text.json. What is that about? Well, system.text.json is, well, the future of JSON in .NET Core. Now, .NET Core is kind of where .NET is going. So already in Unity, we can use .NET Standard, which is kind of an aspect of that. But it's not there for us yet, but it will do. And just a quick look at this. We've got Serialize, so it's kind of like the Serialize pattern that went before it uses, which is a little bit more additional work. Okay, it's got the shaping, which is great. You can see here the temp, the lowercase t. We can do ignore, and we can do that in our code as well right now. That's not a problem. And it uses a writer like we saw before with the serializer, so it's kind of back. We've gone back a couple of steps there, but that's fine. At least we know what we're talking about. So why bother? Well, really, it's because of the performance, right? It's as it says here, it's 2 times faster to deserialize, 1.5 times faster. It's just faster, and doesn't use up as much memory. And I've seen some performance figures that are, incredible on the server side. But unless you're writing a database in Unity, really, I don't think you're going to be that amazingly worried about the performance. I mean, we're talking, a level that shouldn't be worrying us at all. We shouldn't really be trying to parse JSON on the fly in a game anyway, in my opinion. Right. So that's where we are. So I think really, just to say, if you're going to do something very simple and you just want some very basic things, then carry on using JsonUtility. That's fine. Maybe it will change in the future and be able to handle more complex stuff. But out the box, there is nothing at the moment that is going to convince me that I shouldn't be using JSON.NET straight out, because it will just all work and it's just so much simpler, and I don't have to worry about whether I'm going to use a dictionary or not. I don't want the JsonUtility to tell me how I'm going to code. That's just not how I roll at all. So I hope you found this useful, and digging through this sort of mists and quagmire of serialization and JSON and XML and what all these different things are. And hopefully you'll come out thinking, do you know what, JSON's actually pretty good, and JSON.NET's going to help me get there. Okay, thanks for listening.